week I'm going to talk about the life of Constable. Now, in Tate Britain, there is a room dedicated to Constable's work. You go in the front door, turn right through the 1930 and 40 room, then you go all the way through the Claw Gallery, which contains Turner's work. And in the far corner, there's a room dedicated to Constable. But I took the view that the works in that room aren't representative of his work as a whole. So I'm not taking you around that room, and I'm talking about his life chronologically. Next week, we'll be going to this room here, if you can see my cursor, the 1840 room, and talking about the pre-Raphaelites. But let's get on to the life of Constable. And I thought some of you probably know his life in some detail because you've seen programs about him. Others might not. So I thought a way of addressing that is to quickly just go through some textual points covering the main points of his life, and then I'll be going through them again. So it's just to get everybody on a sort of a level playing field. He was born in East Bergholt in Suffolk in 1776, the year after Turner was born, so they were contemporaries. And he was born the son of a mill owner, corn merchant, and in fact coal merchant and farmer, so a fairly a wealthy person that I'll talk more about later. He was sent to private school, although the second and boarding school, and the second boarding school he went to, he was mistreated by one of the staff, and so his family brought him home, and he later went to Dedham Grammar School. He was the second oldest son, and he was expected, well, initially he was expected to run the business, take over the business, because the eldest son was mentally, I don't know the exact problem, but mentally incapable of running the business. So it fell to John Constable. He wasn't keen to run the business. He always preferred drawing, painting, and so on, but he resigned himself to it. But then in 1799, his younger brother, Abraham, became 16 and said he was keen to run the business. The father agreed, and so the younger son was trained to run the business, and so Constable was free to dedicate his life to painting and joined the Royal Academy School at a fairly an older age than most of those who joined, who were 18. He was in his early 20s. So he was funded by his parents. They paid for him to go to the school. He finished the school, started painting. He painted landscapes. He got some works exhibited at the Royal Academy, but they were small landscapes, and they weren't, critics and newspapers didn't really write about them. So he wasn't particularly known as an artist, and he didn't sell much. His family then because they were supporting him, put some pressure on him to make money, and he started painting portraits, and he sold a few, although in his whole life in England, he only sold about 20 paintings. And in France, we'll come to this later, in just a few years, 2 or 3 years, he sold 20, but not really enough to earn enough money. And the paintings that he sold were mostly, as we'll see, sold to friends and patrons who liked his work. Then in 1816, he married his lifelong love, Maria Bicknell. He, a few years later, started painting his much larger paintings called 6-footers that got him more attention, more notice. He sold a few and made his name such that that year he was made an associate, not an academician, but an associate academician, a lower ranking, and that got him more noticed. And the large 6-foot landscapes got him more noticed as well. And one of those, in fact, the Hay Wain, he sent to France to be exhibited at the Paris Salon, and it won a gold medal. He became very well known in France. Unfortunately, then, the love of his life, Maria, died in 1828. He wore black for the rest of his life. He was in mourning, and by then he had 7 children to look after as well. And he died not that many years later in 1837. He wasn't made an academician until that year, or the beginning of the year after she died. She died in October, and he was made an academician the following year in the spring, when he was 52, quite an old age in those days for someone to be made an academician. And then in the last years of his life, although he was in mourning, he painted a lot. He started to give lectures, so he became better known. But let's let's go back again. So that's to give you a broad overview of his life, but let's start looking at some of his pictures. And this is the first sketch, in fact, one of the first of his works that we have. And it's an early drawing, and it's the earliest. He didn't do a lot of self-portraits. This is one of the earliest. In case you're wondering, he would have used 2 mirrors to do this drawing. This is after he's finished at the Academy School. He was, as I said, the second son. And by this stage, his younger brother, Abraham, had started to take over the business, and he was being supported by an allowance from his father and from a few commissions, but the commissions weren't enough to support him in the style he was used to. I think his allowance at this stage from his father was £100 a year, so not too bad, enough to live like a minor gentleman, if you like, in London. He was also, his family was indirectly, through his mother, fairly well connected, and so he got letters of introduction and met some well-known famous people, including Sir George Beaumont, who was a collector who saw his work and encouraged him. And it was at that stage that he saw some of the one work by George Beaumont that George Beaumont owned by Claude Lorraine, called Hagar and the Angel, and that had a big impact on him. It was one of the first real works of fine art that he'd seen close up, and that inspired him to work harder as an artist. He was very he loved the land that he grew up in, and painted mostly landscapes, started painting portraits because they were easier to sell. The only landscapes weren't that popular at this time, except for topological landscapes that of say someone's manor house, like Wivenhoe Park. He was commissioned to paint. He saw himself as being inspired by the leading artists like Claude Lorraine, Thomas Gainsborough, and so on. But he was also inspired by the countryside that he'd grown up in. Excuse me for a moment, because I've just seen that there's a video still on that I need to switch off. Just check. Right. Sorry about that. let's move on though to, so that's an earlier sketch. This pair of portraits is very interesting. They are in the Tate. They're not always on display. They show his father, Golding Constable, and his mother, Anne, and it's a portrait pair. They're looking towards each other, painted by all accounts in 1815, which was the year that his mother died. In 1816, his father died. However, there's a mystery here. Let's start. If you look at these paintings, you'll see that the painting of his father is a slightly different sort of style from the painting of his mother. It's a bit looser, or putting it another way, if you look at his mother's face, you'll see that it's slightly more, what's the word, plastic looking than the face of his father. So there's a different style in the way the clothing is painted, slightly different. You'll also notice, and this is the critical point, that the Tate has got two dates on his mother's portrait. It says circa 1800 to 1805, or perhaps, it's the question mark, 1815. Now, some people believe, oh, let me put up another painting by Ramsay Richard Reinagle of Constable. This is a portrait of Constable, which is another reason to put it up. And it was painted in 1799. You might wonder, well, who's this Reinagle fellow? Because he's not a very well-known artist, but he was well known to Constable because he was his friend. They both went, or they were both at, the Royal Academy School at the same time. And we know that he invited Reinagle back to East Bergholt, to his family home. So if you look at the style of this painting of John Constable and compare it with the painting of Anne Constable, you can see there are similarities. So one group of historians believe that Reinagle, when he went to East Bergholt, painted as a present, painted a portrait of Constable's mother in sometime between 1800 and 1805. So one theory is that the portrait of his mother is not by Constable, it's by Reinagle. Now, the other piece of evidence, or I should say, to add to the mystery might be another way of putting it, is this portrait. Now, this portrait is in Colchester and Ipswich Museum, and if you go there, they have a lot of Constable's work. And we know this is by Constable because it stayed in the family. So it's got good provenance. And it's a painting of his mother, as you can see, painted, we know, in 1805. Very different from the other portrait of his mother stylistically. But if you look at the way she's dressed and the dog, it's the same picture, but switched left to right. So what are we to make of that? Well, first of all, it seems to be telling us, I mean, maybe it was a quick sketch, but it seems to be telling us that this is the way Constable painted in 1805, which maybe adds to the evidence that if the one on the left was 1805, maybe it was Reinagle. But the other theory is that Constable did paint the one on the right in 1805, but then in 1815, he reworked, when, remember, his mother died, he reworked this portrait that he painted in 1805, and that Constable painted the one on the left in 1805 and switched it around left to right in order to create a companion to the portrait of his father that we know he painted in 1815. you're going to say to me, yes, but didn't I say at the beginning that these are slightly different styles? Well, you could argue that they're close enough to justify them both being claimed to be by Constable. So we have these two possibilities that I won't repeat, but I just wanted to show you, by diving down into a bit more detail, I wanted to show you that even an artist as well known and as much studied as John Constable, there's still mysteries and questions unanswered, and various possibilities. But let's move on. Before I move on, just to fill in a bit more of the background, Anne, his mother, was the daughter of a prosperous London cooper, a wealthy London cooper, and the family was well connected. And it's thought she probably met Golding when he came to London on one of his visits to go to the market, and that's how they met. And she is the one who, more than him, encouraged constables to take up art and to study art and go to the Royal Academy. And it was her who introduced Constable to Beaumont, the collector. His father was, and this is relevant later, in fact, relevant to the next picture I'm going to show you. His father saw himself, was wealthy, one of the wealthiest in the village, and lived the life of a country squire, so saw himself as a man of fortune and well-to-do. He not only had a mill and later acquired another mill, Dedham Mill and Flatford Mill, but he owned a farm and he owned a boat. He owned a boat that was moored a few miles away, which he used to take his corn to market. So he lived the life of a country squire. However, this is not sufficiently wealthy for some, and I'll work my way towards that remark. This is Maria Bicknell, and she was the daughter of Charles Bicknell, who was solicitor to the Prince Regent, and she was granddaughter to Reverend Dr. Durand Rudd, who was the rector of East Bergholt, but he was also chaplain in ordinary to George III. And so he came to East Bergholt because he was rector there, and it was on a few occasions when Maria visited him in East Bergholt that we think Constable met her. He first met her, we think, when she was 12 in 1800, and they later fell in love. However, her father, and particularly her grandfather, the Reverend Rudd, thought that the constables were too lower class, that he had grander ideas for his granddaughter, Maria. And he thought that she couldn't manage on less than £400 a year, a sum that Constable couldn't hope to aspire to unless he became an extremely successful painter. So Dr. Rudd said he would, that they couldn't marry, and that in fact he would disinherit her. And in fact, he said he would disinherit all of her parents and all of his grandchildren if she didn't obey him. It's so extreme that we think that he probably had fallen out, had an argument with Golding Constable, and that's the real reason, but we don't know. The reason he gave is that they weren't sufficiently well connected or important to marry his granddaughter. So they fell in love in 1809, when I think she was 18, but couldn't marry. They just stayed meeting each other occasionally, and Constable was trying to make his way as an artist to earn enough for them to marry. What eventually happened is, in fact, I told you that his father died in 1816, and the children inherited the estate, and Constable received a sixth of the estate, which became managed then by his brother Abraham, and that generated £200 a year. Still not the £400 a year, but his income doubled, and he sold a few paintings occasionally, and the £200 a year, it seems, was justification enough for Maria's father to agree to them to marry, and so they immediately went off and married in the October of that year in the Church of St. Martin's in the Field in London, and then went on honeymoon around Weymouth, where there are paintings, sketches that we have by Constable. Now, what actually happened later is that the grandfather didn't disinherit her. I can tell you the end of the story. And maybe he was softened by the fact that Constable's father had died, and that Maria had children. He had great-grandchildren, and when he died, she did inherit from Dr. Rudd. She wasn't disinherited. They were deeply in love. They had 7 children altogether, but she started to develop tuberculosis and died young of tuberculosis, called consumption in those days. Let me move on, because I'll come back to some aspects of their marriage as we go through. So, in a way, stepping back slightly, 1809, he painted this picture of their family home in East Bergholt. This is where he was born. In fact, his father lived in Flatford Mill, but it wasn't big enough for the family, and so he had this house built in East Bergholt. It was pulled down in the 1840s, so it no longer exists. 2 years before Constable was born, and he was born in this house. So it's the family home that he grew up in. And I'll give you now one of the quotes from Constable, one of his most famous quotes. And Constable wrote a lot. And later, as I said, he gave lectures. So we know quite a bit about the way he thought. He wrote in one of his letters, "I should paint my own places best. Painting is with me but another word for feeling. I associate my careless boyhood to all that lies on the banks of the Stour." And so for him, where you were born and the area around it, its geography, its hills, its climate, determines your character. He thought about it in that extreme a way. And he thought that where you were born, the location, therefore implied your identity. So if you moved away, you were losing part of your identity. Now, he did actually later move away from this area, but it was that big a wrench for him. And he thought that the area that determines your identity is the area you can walk to starting early in the morning and get back home for dinner. So I don't know how far that is, but perhaps it's something like 10 miles around your home. You could walk, so that's a 20-mile walk in a day, walking. So that circle around his home, he thought, was for everybody, determined their personality, the way they were, and was the essence, if you like, of what he would think of as their soul. And that is what motivated him and determined the way he thought about painting. And that's why he represented the area around his home. He was representing himself and the way he felt about that area he grew up in, which he loved. He had a very happy childhood. And this is one of the paintings that was exhibited at the Royal Academy in 1810. He had a few paintings exhibited. This one was talked about by critics, probably because you can see 3 generations, and it reminded people of the then often quoted well-known poem by Thomas Gray about written the elegy in a country churchyard. So it was, but it was just a small landscape. It's a fairly small painting, this sort of size, and didn't gather much attention. And that was like most of the paintings he produced at this time. They were small. Some of them were accepted at the Royal Academy, but they were mostly ignored by newspapers and critics who wrote about the works there. And he didn't sell many of them. Right, just moving on to a slightly larger painting. It's about a meter, not a 6-footer, but larger than most of the pictures that he'd produced. And it was noticed. It was painted in 1816. It was painted on the spot. Now, Constable was one of the earliest people to paint en plein air in the outside in oils. And he was convinced that his the old master Claude Lorraine, who he admired, painted outside in oils, but we now know he didn't. Claude painted in watercolors or drew. All of his oil paintings were done in the studio, but because Constable was convinced of this, he painted in oils outside. We know he sometimes used techniques like he used a piece of glass on an easel, and he would sketch the scene behind on the glass. And so he was keen to get the perspective accurate. And it's often thought that Constable's work is, to use I think an overused word, photographic, but this was painted in 1816 and exhibited in 1817. 1816 is called the year without a summer. If you remember, I've told some of you this before, but the volcano, Mount Tambora, one of the largest eruptions in recorded history, or the largest in recorded history, darkened the skies of the world for the whole of the following year, and then created bright red sunsets for the next few years. But the year after Mount Tambora, 1816, there wasn't a summer. It rained all year. And in fact, there's the well-known story of Mary Shelley was confined to the castle in Switzerland and wrote Frankenstein in 1816. But look at the sky here. The point I'm trying to make here is that although many people, you'll read that Constable painted exactly what he saw in front of him, we know of many of his paintings, like the painting of Salisbury Cathedral. It's not that large. He exaggerated the size. He added rainbows. The picture of Wivenhoe Park, it's been shown you can't show the lake and the house from where he was standing. So he made adjustments to the picture. And here, I would argue, he's showing a sunny day with cumulus clouds and a blue sky at a year where no one saw the blue sky. The clouds covered the sky continuously the whole year, and most days it rained. Nevertheless, his use of color and his representation of the landscape was completely different from the way people had painted up to this point. More of that in a moment. 1816 was the year his father died, the year he got married at the end of the year in October, and things changed a lot for him because he became a married man. He moved to London, and it was also I don't want to add too many facts to this, but it was also the year after the end of the long war with France, because the Battle of Waterloo was in 1815, and the Corn Laws were introduced this year, which fixed the price of corn to stop cheap foreign imports of corn and to repay what the farmers claimed had been their subsidizing of the war. But as a consequence, bread became so expensive that many people went hungry, and that resulted in unrest, which was exacerbated by the fact that many farmers in the war against France had introduced new techniques and machinery which displaced workers on the farm, which meant that many people had no jobs, and many more came back from the wars wounded and couldn't get a job. The result was famine, dissent, riots, which led to the Peterloo massacre, which led to the suspension of habeas corpus, new poor laws, the introduction of the workhouse, and in the 1830s, the swing riots. Sorry to compress so much information into this one painting, but I'm trying to create a context for looking at this work. Just briefly, this year, 1817, was when Constable and his wife, Maria, came back to Suffolk for a long holiday, and Constable walked around the area. It's the last time he painted directly in oils in the vicinity of East Bergholt, and a lot of the paintings were semi-finished. And it's interesting, if you look down here, this part of the painting, it's unfinished. It's not a sketch in a sense, because some parts of the painting are finished. It's thought that he was rushing to finish a number, or not finish, but to sketch out a number of paintings of areas where he lived, to take back to London to turn into finished paintings. But this one, he never put more work into it. So he never finished. So that's 1817. He's married, he's been on his honeymoon, he comes back briefly, but they're now living in London. Now, this is 1819, 1820. He was living in London. They were both living in London. She started to have children in end of 1817, December, I think, was the first child was John. The second child they called Maria. And her tuberculosis had started to develop. And so he rented a house in Hampstead for her to live in. But he continued working in the studio in London, which he actually changed location and moved to Charlotte Street in London, where he had a studio, and where he said he could walk to Hampstead in an hour. It was about 3 miles from Charlotte Street to Hampstead, or he could send a message in and he knew it would get there in an hour, so he could stay closely in touch and get away from visitors who would visit his wife. And so he had a quiet day working continuously in the studio. So although he was working every day, he produced a lot of paintings, he sold very little, and those he sold were to a few patrons and connoisseurs, but a very small number, and friends and family. This is one of his earliest views of Hampstead, with a house called the Salt Box, this house here in the distance, and with a distant view of Harrow right over here, the church in the distance. And he often painted views around Hampstead. And the following year was when he started his series of cloud studies, one of which is in the Constable room at the Tate. and he spent 1821, 1822, he painted hundreds of oil sketches of clouds, which he annotated with the weather, date, time, wind speed, direction, weather conditions. In other words, it was like a scientific observation. And we know that the studies that he did, like this one, he didn't use these pictures of clouds in his paintings. In other words, they weren't preparatory sketches for a painting. They were studies of clouds in their own right. It was like a scientific observation of clouds. And of course, it was Luke Howard, the amateur meteorologist, who had proposed the naming of clouds in 1802, which became a sort of well known. The names we use today, cumulus and stratus and cirrus, had just been invented by Luke Howard a few years previously. So observations of clouds and skies was something that a lot of people were interested in, because it was being looked at scientifically for the first time. So we think that's what he was doing. We know he wrote later to a friend, much later in his life, in fact, the year before he died, "My observations on clouds and skies are on scraps and bits of paper, and I've never put them together so as to form a lecture, which I shall do and probably deliver at Hampstead next summer." Well, he never delivered the lecture because he died. But it just shows that he was seeing these sketches as the basis of a lecture about the observations he made. And we know they were accurate. He wrote on the back of this, "Large towering cumulus clouds pregnant with rain." And it was the 27th of August, 1822, and independent meteorological observations back up everything that he wrote on these. So they were accurate portraits of the clouds. Now, this is an important painting. It's now in New York in the Frick collection. A Scene on the River Stour, or sometimes called The White Horse. And it's the first of his 6-foot paintings, which were generally 6 foot wide and 4 foot high, large. He was encouraged to do this because the Flatford Mill painting I showed you previously was much better received, and a lot more people wrote about it because it was larger, so they noticed it. And so I think Constable thought to himself, well, maybe I could work even larger. And the other aspect of working at this size, a 6-footer, is that previously no one had painted a landscape this large. They used the 6-foot format for history paintings. Now, if you remember the layers, the genres, the types of painting, history painting was at the top, and then portraits and so on, and right down to near the bottom there was landscapes and still life paintings. So there was another implication in painting it large. It wasn't just to get noticed, which it did, it was to raise, to elevate a landscape painting to the level of a history painting, and because of its size. Now, many landscapes, most landscapes would include columns, Roman, Greek columns, some hint of mythology, which elevated them to be history paintings. But he hasn't done this. This is critical point. He's used the format of a history painting, that elevated level of art, to paint the lowest genre of art, a landscape, which everyone would have recognized as a landscape of the Suffolk countryside. And so this caused controversy, but also got attention. And also a lot of people saw it as a breakthrough, as something interesting, something novel. So it split the critics. Some liked it and some hated it. I'll expand on that in a moment. But it got attention, it got praise, And it was this year, if you remember, 1819, that he was made an associate of the Royal Academy. Someone's just asked me, how did he pack so much detail in? Well, I was going to make a point about that, because he was criticized for the paintings being so rough and lacking detail. And it's a bit misleading, because you've got to remember, and I'll show you an enlargement in a minute, but you've got to remember that this is a 6-foot painting. And when you stand close, you can see the brush strokes. So when you stand back, it looks like a lot of detail, but when people looked closely, they saw the brush strokes, which you weren't meant to see in a history painting. You were meant to smooth them out and make the brush strokes invisible. So, but I'll pick up the detail point on the next picture. So this made his name. This was sold, by the way, although it was sold for 100 guineas, but it was bought by his friend, but nevertheless, it was sold to John Fisher. Right. This is so well known as to need no introduction. It was originally called Landscape: Noon, but we know it as the Hay Wain, which is the wagon in the River Stour there. Probably many of you have visited this site, and I found when I went there just the surprise of this feeling that you're suddenly in a painting, because it just reminds you so strongly when you stand there of the painting. Now, when I say stand there, for those of you who haven't been there, we're standing on what's now a sort of a path, and behind us, directly behind us, is Flatford Mill. And if you look over the right-hand side, if you could see my cursor waving around over there, this piece of brickwork here is the edge of the mill. So behind us, we have Flatford Mill looking at the River Stour. And over here on the left is Willie Lott's cottage. And Constable, admire is the wrong word, but Willie Lott lived to the age of 80, and it said he only left his cottage he only slept away from his cottage for 4 nights in his entire life, which is the sort of thing that Constable admired, for want of a better word, that's what life was about, to stay close to one's roots. He didn't paint it photographically, and I took a photograph when I was there. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to slowly, watch carefully, dissolve the photograph onto the painting, and watch the cottage. This is the photograph you can see, and I've left it slightly transparent. So the Willie Lott, you can just see the top of Willie Lott's cottage there in the painting, and you can see he exaggerated the size. So he's slightly increased the size of Willie Lott's cottage as a balance. The trees obviously are different, although this tree here looks remarkably the same as the tree in the painting, but the horizon is the same. The river is more or less in the same position, and the bank is more or less in the same position. So in terms of photographic accuracy, if you like, it ticks a lot of boxes. But as I said before, he makes changes to the composition to achieve an effect. Let me go back to the painting, and now I can look more closely at the painting in order to pick up some of the points his critics made. Now we're looking close. We're looking at the painting as closely as someone standing in front of it. You can see what the critics meant by, well, you might not agree with some of the words they used. Critics described the work as disagreeable, disfigured, mannered surface, a huge quantity of chopped hay. A lot of them seem to use the word chopped hay to describe this, this brushwork. He was criticised for not finishing the work as a large work would be expected to be painted, and he replied, Constable replied, "I don't see any finish in nature." The Times noted in a critical way his scattering of white spots over the surface of the picture, and you can see that particularly in this tree here and over here, and he did it more and more over the years, and it continued to be criticized. He did it in order to enliven the picture and to correspond. If you stand back, it's the sunlight reflecting off the leaves. So it was done consciously and to create a particular effect. Another criticism, and it's worth hearing a number of these. The Gentleman's Magazine wrote, "An execrable taste, having no resemblance to any appearance in nature." It reminds me of a time when the patron George Beaumont, remember I mentioned him before, criticized Constable's use of green. He said that grass isn't that color. It should be the color of an old violin. So Constable got an old violin and laid it on the grass to show that they're completely different colors. But I think what Beaumont really meant was, and what the critics meant, was that they were used to old masterworks where the trees and the grass were shades of brown, probably because many of them, the varnish had faded and turned brown, but that's what they were used to. However, when it was exhibited in 1821, to a French artist, Théodore Géricault, and a French writer saw it, and Géricault wrote back to Delacroix. He was stunned, quite stunned by the painting, and they went back and arranged for a few years later, in 1824, for Constable's work to be exhibited at the Paris Salon. Constable sent 3 works: View of the Stour near Dedham, Yarmouth Harbour, and the Hay Wain. And the Hay Wain in France, in the Paris Salon, won the gold medal, which was awarded by Charles X to Constable, although of course Constable was never there. He never travelled abroad. He said, "I would rather be a poor artist in England than a rich artist abroad." He acquired an Anglo-French dealer called John Arrowsmith, who paid £250 for those 3 paintings that were exhibited at the Paris Salon, and sold them on and sold more of his paintings. It led to problems because Constable, I don't know, didn't trust the French and insisted that he got paid in full before sending the painting or even painting the painting. So Arrowsmith, the dealer, commissioned a painting from him, and Constable said, "I'm not even going to start it unless you send £400. Arrowsmith immediately sent £400, and Constable continued working on other things, started the painting. We don't know quite which painting it was. And later, the following year, Arrowsmith visited Constable in London and to see what progress had been made on this painting he'd paid £400 for. And he didn't speak English very well. And also we know Arrowsmith at the time was very short of money. And he said something to Constable. We don't know exactly what he said, probably, "Where's my painting?" And Constable later wrote that the French dealer was so excessively impertinent and used such language as never was used to me at my easel before, that, and Arrowsmith immediately apologized, but Constable refused to accept his apology and Arrowsmith left, and essentially Constable got no more commissions in France, and shortly after, Arrowsmith went bankrupt. Constable's friend, John Fisher, wrote to Constable, and I'd imagine he had told Constable this many times before. He wrote, "We are all given to torment ourselves with imaginary evils, but no man has ever had this disease in such alarming paroxysms as yourself. You imagine difficulties where none exist, displeasure where none is felt, contempt where none is shown, and neglect where none is meant." So that gives you, I think, an insight into Constable's personality. That was his best friend telling him. And I think that's what happened when the dealer, there was a misunderstanding. Constable refused to accept the apology. And that was the end of, although Arrowsmith managed to sell 20 works in that short period, that was the end. And Constable, remember, refused to travel to the continent. That was the end of his sales. However, he had a lasting influence because, as I said, it won the gold medal, this painting. Let's actually go back to the full painting. And it was seen as revolutionary in France. Delacroix, who was a famous painter at this time, went and repainted the painting he was working on in his studio after seeing this. He said that it was the way he had tackled, painted, and the color of the greens and so on, and the other tones of the picture that convinced him that Delacroix had been painting incorrectly. And it brought about a change in France to the way that landscapes were seen. It was a revolutionary painting, as recognized by the gold medal. One other point to make, a couple of things. There's a man fishing here. You might not have noticed. That's his boat. There's a dog here. You might wonder about what this dark shadow is here. Well, we know in the sketch there was a man on a horse, and in the underpainting there's a barrel here that he painted over, but over time the paint has thinned and we can see through. There's a woman drawing at Willie Lott's cottage, drawing water from the river here. And the interesting thing is the people who are cutting corn over here in the distance are using a technique that hadn't been used for 20 years. It was now done by machinery. So this is nostalgia for the time when he was a child. He's remembering what how farming was done when he was a child. And this was a time of riots, which started in Suffolk. And his brother Abram wrote the following year to Constable, "Never a night without seeing fires near or at a distance. The rioters were setting fire to hayricks and to barns." So again, Constable is representing his feelings about the countryside that he knew as a child. I need to move on to his, well, indirectly, his wife's illness. Maria's health was failing. This is in 1824. He took her down to Brighton because they thought the sea air would do her good. It didn't, but he would go for walks. He would walk some days to Devil's Dyke, some days along the coast in both directions. He didn't like Brighton. He described it as drowned in the din and lost in the tumult of stagecoaches. At one stage in a letter, he described it as Piccadilly by the seaside. But he did sketch and paint a lot. And this is a painting of the chain pier. I've spoken previously of the history of the chain pier. It was a major scientific marvel that people went down to Brighton to see. It was also painted by Turner the following year from out at sea. And this, Constable's painting, he has added these picturesque fishing boats on the left, and remember, this was a time when there were no tubes of paint. I was going to make this point earlier when I was talking about him painting in oils outside. He ground the paints in the studio, and then the artists would put them in a pig's bladder, which they then tied up around a cork and to keep the paint from drying out. And they would take these bladders of paint and brushes and rags and a palette knife and then open it up. So it was difficult. It wasn't just squeezing paint onto a palette. It was quite a palaver. And he would do a lot of sketches where he would pin the paper to the lid of his paint box. And in general, he would take a couple of hours to do a sketch. By the way, this painting was originally slightly larger. We know it's the left-hand side has been cut off by about 23 centimeters, 9 inches, and it was closed by a sailor. If I show you the sketch, and I should have said earlier, all of his large paintings, he did a 6-foot sketch for. This is the sketch, and you can see that it's the painting's extended on the left. We don't know why the painting was chopped on the left. Let's go back to the painting. We don't know why it was chopped on the left, but we do know it was before 1888. But the Chain Pier, Brighton. In 1828, his wife Maria died, and of tuberculosis. She was only 41, and he wrote, "Hourly do I feel the loss of my departed angel. God only knows how my children will be brought up. The face of the world is totally changed for me." He went into a melancholic phase. He'd always suffered a bit from depression. He had to care for the 7 children. I should say that about a month or two before Maria died, her father died and left her. Remember, Dr. Rudd, her grandfather, died, left her £2,500, but her father died and left her £20,000, and then she died. So Constable had £20,000 plus. So he's concern about earning a living and having enough money to look after the children had ended. He actually spent the next couple of years, well, 1830 to 32, producing a book of mezzotints engravings, which lost him a lot of money. In fact, if you read books about Constable, it implies he spent all of the £20,000 on these engravings, but that's ridiculous. He when he died, his estate, excluding his paintings, was worth £25,000. But it was a disaster. The engravings didn't sell, so but it didn't cost that much. There's another question. Did he have the full range of colors? Yes, he had a full range of colors, but he didn't have some of the artificially produced colors like mauve and so on. The colors produced by coal tar later on in the century, after roughly about 1840, 1850, and tubes of paint came in the 1840s after he died, and a much wider range of very bright and stable artificial colors came in later. So he had a full range of colors, but from natural sources. Coming on, sorry, there's a bit of an aside from the painting we're actually looking at. This is Hadley Castle. Now he did a sketch, a drawing of Hadley Castle a long time before. I think it was, yeah, I just checked. It was 1814, that he first sketched Hadley Castle, but he didn't turn it into a painting. It wasn't until much later, his wife died, that he started working on this sketch. This is the sketch that's in the Tate on display. And he used these sketches, full-size sketches, which no other artist that I know of did. So to produce a 6-foot painting, he produced a 6-foot sketch in order, we think, to determine the composition and the layout and the balance of the painting. And we know he made changes and tried different things, but it was painted very roughly. In fact, in the 20th century, many critics started to fall in love with his sketches, and many people today feel that his sketches are much more powerful statements of his abilities than his finished paintings. Like this is the finished painting, which is now in America. I see what they mean. There's a lot of energy in the sketches, but that obviously is not what Constable intended. They were exercises to determine the composition prior to producing the finished painting. His finished paintings were still being criticized for lack of finish. So his wife had died. He produced this sketch and then the finished painting. He was becoming well known. He was visiting his friend, lifelong friend, John Fisher. He knew John Fisher's father, whose name was also John Fisher, and John Fisher became the something like the rector, I can't remember his exact title, of Salisbury Cathedral. And so he went down to Salisbury. In fact, he visited Salisbury many times. He visited Salisbury with his wife before she died. But this is when he visited after she died in 1831. Now, sadly, his friend, John Fisher, died the following year in 1832. But in this painting, it's been interpreted in many ways. If you go to this site, there's a pub near where we're standing. The Salisbury Cathedral is much smaller, in fact. So he's made it larger. The church you can see on the left, I think it's called St. Thomas's, and you just about see here their gravestones. And so this has been seen as, and if you look carefully at the wagon, some people can see a woman dressed in black alongside the wagon driver. There is certainly something there next to the wagon driver. So, and he used the rainbow as a sign of exhilaration, freshness. These are words he used in his letters, but also redemption. So it has been seen as a sort of a semi-religious painting with his wife, I don't know what I want to over-interpret it, but his wife returning from the graveyard and being redeemed in the joy of the early morning light. The rainbow, in fact, scientifically, the rainbow couldn't exist at that point with the sun in the direction it's in, but the rainbow comes down on the house here where John Fisher lived. So it wasn't painted from life. It was painted, and I think it was painted symbolically, but it was what Constable actually wrote was about the rainbow. I mean more than the rainbow itself. I mean dewy light and freshness, the departing shower, and the exhilaration of the returning sun. Notice he doesn't talk about a deeper meaning. He says he means more than the rainbow, but what he means is its effect in nature, its lightness and freshness, the sign that the showers are going, the exhilaration of the returning sun. And I think that says a lot about the way he thought about nature. But of course, later art critics, art historians have interpreted this painting much more deeply, maybe over deeply, compared to the way he thought and wrote about it. Who knows what he deeply felt about it. But it's certainly, I think, something to do with death and redemption. It was bought in 2013, actually, this painting, a partnership of galleries, and it circulates a bit. They raised £23 million to buy it. And it was a partnership of, let me check, the Tate, the National Museum Wales, the National Gallery of Scotland, the Colchester and Ipswich Museum, and the Salisbury and South Wiltshire Museums. So I think this painting circulates around all those museums. He published, he in the catalogue, when this was shown at the Royal Academy, he included 9 lines from a poem by James Thomson called The Four Seasons Summer, which the poem tells of a story of 2 young lovers out walking, and as they walk through a wood, there's a thunderstorm and there's a bolt of lightning which kills the young woman, and she dies in her lover's arms. So when I said this painting is to do with death, there are a number of indicators of that. In the Constable room at the Tate, there is this painting, The Opening of Waterloo Bridge, Whitehall Stairs, June the 18th, 1817. Notice he didn't exhibit it, or he didn't paint it until much later. He arrived, if you remember, he married in 1816. He went to London in 1817. We know he saw the opening of Waterloo Bridge on the 2nd anniversary of the Battle of Waterloo. And that explosion in the middle of Waterloo Bridge here is a salute. Cannons saluting the opening, St. Paul's in the background. And what we see in the foreground is the Prince Regent, and he was a fantastic loyalist. He was a high Tory constable. The Prince Regent getting into his barge, and alongside it, the Lord Mayor's barge. There are some boys playing in the foreground here. It's painted very, I was going to say loosely, but very actively, a very active surface. It's worth going to look at to see the way he painted. Animated is a good word. An animated surface and a variety of handling, a lot done with the palette knife. And a very, in that sense, I don't like to use this word really, but a very modern painting. So he, how are we doing? 5 more minutes. This was the painting that was hung alongside a very cool tone sea piece by Turner, who it's said, or we know, Turner on the what's called varnishing day, 3 days before the exhibition opens, went to his painting and added a bright red boy to his work to try to redress the balance between this large active painting and Turner's cool sea piece. Incidentally, mentioning red, you know, Delacroix often added red to his paint, red scarves and so on to the paintings. Constable did. I don't know whether you noticed, but in the center of the Hay Wain, the horses, what's it called? What the horse is wearing is colored red. So Constable also often added a small patch of red in his paintings. Not in this one though. This is one of the not the last, but one of the last paintings he worked on, 1835. In fact, he worked on it for a couple of years. In some ways, I think he overworked it. He worked it and worked it again. It's called the Valley Farm, and the building we can see, I think again slightly enlarged, is Willie Lott's cottage. It's the other side of Willie Lott's cottage. Some of the critics didn't like it, and funnily enough, for the opposite reason now. He was by this stage a Royal Academician. Incidentally, some of the critics were really nasty. He inherited, or his wife inherited, and then he inherited £20,000. Well, that made him a figure in society, someone worth £20,000. And one of the critics wrote, the only reason he was made an academician that year is because he's now worth £20,000. So that's how nasty some of the critics were. But with this painting, the critic wrote, he ought to be whipped for thus maiming a real genius for landscape. So this is a critic who likes Constable's normal landscapes, that feels that he had overdone this one, or he hadn't, his full power hadn't come through in this landscape. A lot of critics have read deeply into this painting because it's towards the end of his life. It represents life's journey down the river to back home again to Willie Lott's cottage. Some have even read, it's very hard to see, but in the full painting you can see it. You see just here in the full-size painting, you can see it's a man looking over the fence, a beggar. And beggars hardly ever reached East Bergholt, which Constable was pleased about. He wrote about that, we're hidden away here and we don't get all these nasty beggars. He didn't use the word nasty, but word equivalent to that. So this is also the outside world starting to impinge upon his idyllic view of the East Bergholt landscape. Some have interpreted it that way. Nevertheless, although some critics didn't like it, he did sell this painting to an established notable collector, Robert Vernon, for £300, the largest price paid for Constable work in his lifetime. Right. Let me just say one more thing about this work, because we've got 30 seconds. After he died, his estate was worth 25,000. He, including many paintings, because he didn't sell many paintings, but he worked really hard. His house was full of paintings, and by the time he died, and perhaps because he died, his work started to become worth more and more and more. And so the paintings he left for his children became quite valuable, and many of them weren't sold. They were kept in the family, but the family had the £25,000, plus they sold a few works, and so his family were well off. Only one of them became an artist, but only one of his sons, called Golding, had any children. So apart from Golding, the family died out, but Golding's children had children up to the present day, and many of those ancestors of his became artists. So the name Constable is still associated with art.